Film Festival with Fred
Oh no,
Rosenbaum.
they got that crazy thing across.
So, I know everyone likes to talk, but I'm going to ask everyone to be quiet. And
Stephen, actually, Stephen, just leave it on this. It's fine.
It doesn't work. It only works on Apple.
Okay.
I had it right here. I had it here. Just turn it on. Let me
I'm
see.
turning it on. Turning it on. Okay.
But I had it here. Just a minute. Let me try to.
If you have it on the computer, it's easier to mute it.
Okay. We're welcoming Fred Rosenbaum today, who's going to be giving a talk based upon the film June Zero, which we showed around a week and a half ago at the Lafayette Library. In the end of October, on October 22nd, Fred will speak again based on the film Vishanak, which will show probably by Zoom and not in person, so more people can see it, though we had a very good attendance of around 100 people at the Lafayette Library. He will be speaking also several more times this year and next year until our film festival at the end of February, and also be speaking at least once during the film festival. Fred is, of course, our scholar in residence and our most beloved speaker. He's an award-winning Jewish historian and educator. In 1974, he founded Lehrhaus Judaica, Northern California's premier school for adult Jewish studies, and led it for 43 years, while also teaching at several Bay Area universities. He has written 4 books on local Jewish history, including Cosmopolitans, and has co-authored 4 memoirs of Holocaust survivors, including the best-selling Out on a Ledge with Eva Libitsky. As a traveling scholar, and he's going to lead another tour next year, he has led 25 study tours throughout the world. Fred, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Riva, and thank you, Gabor, for arranging all this. And it's really good to be back for another year with the film festival. Now, Israel was transfixed by the Eichmann case and transformed by it. His capture, trial, and execution are among the most pivotal events for the Jewish state. And they stand out even in a tumultuous history that includes wars of survival and the assassination of a prime minister. The daring and brilliantly implemented mission of the Mossad to seize Eichmann in Buenos Aires and spirit him away to Israel was electrifying. Israelis alive then remember where they were when they learned of Prime Minister Ben-Gurion's stunning announcement in the Knesset. The leading implementer of the final solution will be brought to justice in a Jewish court and tried by Jewish judges. The trial, lasting 4 months in mid-1961, had 110 witnesses, almost all of them survivors, passionately recounting the most appalling atrocities, even those in which Eichmann had no involvement. This is because the prosecution, with Ben-Gurion's strong approval, decided not to hold accountable only one defendant, but also to convey to the Israeli public and to the world the enormity and barbarism of the Holocaust as a whole. Now, due to this all-encompassing approach, many critics called it a show trial. But I prefer the term educational trial, especially for Israeli youth. And the instruction they received was vividly and intimately provided by those who lived through it. One witness, who described herself as having come from the planet Auschwitz, looked at Eichmann and fainted on the stand. She had to be rushed from the courtroom to the hospital. Perhaps the most nightmarish testimony was given by a young woman who survived a massacre of 500 Jews in a killing field in Poland. After seeing her parents and small daughter murdered, she too was shot and fell into a pit of dead bodies, but miraculously survived and climbed out 3 days later. She testified at this trial. A leading journalist covering the trial remarked, "Not one of us will leave here as he was before." Let's look at the first image. Gabor, if you could put that up. People were also captivated by the intensity of Chief Prosecutor, Attorney General Gideon Hausner. As one historian put it, when he stretched out his arm to point at the defendant, his black robe formed a triangle from his wrist to his belt, and he looked like a huge raven, dark and frightening. His thunderous opening statement is widely considered one of the greatest speeches in Israeli history. And I have just a few lines of that here. Hausner said, "When I stand before you here, I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards him who sits in the dock and cry, 'I accuse.' Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore, I will be their spokesman, and in their name, I will unfold the terrible indictment." Okay, you can remove that. Thank you. There was no television in Israel then, but the entire proceeding, 400 hours, was broadcast live on radio, and more than half the population, including a majority of the country's teenagers, followed it closely. Much of it was translated into Yiddish for the many East Europeans still not fluent in Hebrew. And when the court was not in session, many listened to programs about the trial.
I have the potato in the oven heating up, so I don't know how long that'll be, but the green beans will be 14 minutes.
Okay. It was this, the trial was made part of the public school curriculum, which the film shows, you recall, and was also front page news, of course, for the serious newspapers as well as the tabloids. The trial was everywhere. One commentator wrote, "In the air, in the water, in the dust on the trees. When abandoned, it returns in people's eyes." Now let's look at the next image, Gabor. Now here you see Eichmann in 1942, age 36. That picture on the left, that was plastered everywhere, all over Israel. And then you see the Eichmann in 1961 facing his accusers. The trial was not held in a courthouse, but in the largest theater in Jerusalem. Most of the seats were taken by 450 journalists from all over the globe. They, along with countless historians, legal scholars, philosophers, have written copiously on the case over the decades, unsurprisingly focusing on the man in the glass booth, the SS Lieutenant Colonel who headed the Gestapo's Department for Jewish Affairs. Okay, let's remove this slide, Gabor, and replace it with the next image. Number 3. Was he a sadistic monster? Or, as Hannah Arendt wrote in her highly controversial book, subtitled The Banality of Evil.
The banality of evil.
Yeah. Was he an unthinking, if ambitious, bureaucrat? And you see, I just took a very brief quote, but this sums up this part of her book. Eichmann was neither perverted nor sadistic, but rather terribly and terrifyingly normal. This normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities.
Yes.
For he commits his crimes under circumstances that make it impossible for him to know or feel that he is doing wrong. Now, you can imagine the controversy that this caused. Was he fully responsible for coordinating the Holocaust, or a mere cog in the wheel of a massive killing machine? How were his virulently anti-Semitic views formed? How did he evade capture for 15 years after the war? Was Eichmann enabled by the Judenräte, the often pliable and sometimes corrupt Jewish councils in the ghettos? Another explosive claim made by Hannah Arendt. And then the question of execution in a country that hitherto had no death penalty. Hannah Arendt asked, how can any punishment fit the crimes which this man committed? Okay, you can remove that now. Thank you. Now, all of these themes comprise a full university course on the Holocaust. But the film barely touches such subjects, and it does not focus on Eichmann himself. You recall, we never get a frontal view of him in the film, only a shadow or the back of his head or his feet. Rather, the movie follows a different path, one that has rarely been explored. The profound effect of the trial on the identity and society of Israel. Only in the second decade of statehood. The Eichmann case was essential in forming the national narrative, indeed the raison d'etre, the reason for the Jewish state's existence. Because by 1961, even while nation building was well underway in terms of defense, infrastructure, foreign relations, Israel's self-image was still unformed. Like clay in the potter's hands, it needed to be shaped. Let's look at the next slide. Beginning in 1956, the national personification, that is the equivalent of Uncle Sam or John Bull for Britain, the national personification for Israel was Srulik, a boy. This is, a nickname for Yisrael or Yisrael, Srulik. Okay, we can remove that. Thank you, Gabor. The country was still in adolescence, if you will, because statehood in 1948 coincided with a flood tide of new immigrants from all over the world that far outnumbered the pre-war Jewish community. In 1940, there were only 450,000 Jews in mandatory Palestine. And even most of them had arrived in the past decade. In just 18 months following independence, the Jewish population increased by 50%, as hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors entered, and it doubled by 1951 with a tidal wave of immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East, the Mizrahim, literally Jews from Eastern lands, but referring essentially to Jews from Muslim countries. Let's look at the next image. Now, I love these photos. These are taken by, the eminent photographer, Robert Capa, one of the greatest photographers of the 20th century. Look at this top one in particular. This is the boat about to arrive in Israel from Europe. Look at the facial expressions. I mean, some look so hopeful, some excited, some very worried, some not sure, what they will encounter. And then there, Capa took this another one, very similar. Now let's scroll down. That's it. This mammoth 3-year-long aliyah consisted of a vast array of disparate cultures and languages, great variation in the newcomers' economic situation and level of education, marked differences in health and hygiene. Those from Yemen, for example, had been living in pre-industrial conditions, often arrived diseased. Other new immigrants, by contrast, had been successful entrepreneurs in Berlin, Prague, Vienna. Yes, they were all bound together by being Jewish, but of course that too had countless variations of religious practice, ranging from completely secular to ultra-Orthodox. As you know, a fundamental principle of Israel is that any Jew who arrives is not only to be taken in, but also becomes a citizen automatically. Yet the country was so overwhelmed by these mixed multitudes that the majority of Israelis actually favored selective immigration of Jews. But Ben-Gurion insisted that to build up the population, every Jew was needed, and the law of return remained in place. Okay, can remove that, Gabor, thank you. Yet, how could a collective consciousness emerge? Shared national values, goals, a shared sense of the country's destiny. With the population boom in the early years, there were about 1.8 million Jews in Israel by 1960. The majority immigrants. About a quarter were Holocaust survivors, and almost half Mizrahim, a group itself highly diverse, ranging from middle-class Tunisians immersed in French culture to Kurdish and Ethiopian Jews who had been impoverished and largely isolated from the rest of the world. Many commentators on the Eichmann trial note that 1961 was Israel's 13th or bar mitzvah year. Indeed, this Eichmann case would play a major role in its maturity. Afterwards, it would still be a dizzying cultural mosaic, of course, but with much more coherent, overarching sense of purpose. The absorption of almost 1 million new immigrants, this ingathering of the exiles, was one of the greatest accomplishments of any nation in the 20th century. A near miracle when you think of it. Yet large groups of newcomers did not feel integrated for years after. They saw themselves as outsiders, as bit players in the unfolding Israeli drama. They didn't fit into the dominant paradigm created well before the war by the old-timers, who are now a small minority, but who constituted a political, economic, and cultural elite who set the tone for the country. Now, what was that early Israeli archetype? Well, a complete negation of the diaspora. Shlilat HaGalut. And the word galut still carries a negative connotation. This mindset of the pioneers envisioned Zionism as not only achieving sovereignty in the ancient homeland, but also as a mighty revolutionary force, somehow outside of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, that had created a new Hebrew man. It held that the authentic spirit of the Jewish people had roots in ancient Canaan. And then after the destruction of the Second Temple, the true Jewish soul lay dormant during 2 millennia of the Galut to reawaken again as modern Israel. This energetic, muscular Hebrew type is depicted in the film by the character Shlomi Zepko. He's not a shopkeeper or a middleman or an office worker. He builds things, often with his own hands. Not in a city, but in an undeveloped area. He is not cerebral or tentative. He's rather direct and forceful. Most important, he's tough as nails. He can use his fists or deadly weapons. We learn that he was part of the Irgun, led by the fiery Menachem Begin, which committed acts of terror against the British, that he participated in the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946, which killed 91 people, mostly innocent civilians. Now, it's not clear if middle-aged Zebko made Aliyah in the interwar period or was born in the Holy Land, and thus a Sabra. I think you all know the name of the prickly pear, thorny on the outside, but sweet and soft on the inside.
He's really
But
aged.
either way, he exemplifies the attitudes and behavior of the elite, and by virtue of his decades in the country, is well connected to those in power. You know, having friends in the right places in Hebrew slang is protectia, or vitamin P. And the privileged class is sometimes known as the Israeli wasps. White, Ashkenazi, Sabras with protectia. Now, Zebko encounters a father and son who are both on the opposite end of the social ladder, who have immigrated from Libya only a year earlier, fleeing a vicious outbreak of anti-Semitism there. We hear the father's halting Hebrew. He knows a few words, but he cannot construct a full sentence. The son has to translate his dad's Arabic. The word Mizrahi is not used in the film. Neither is the term Sephardi, another word often used because of the liturgy resembling Spanish Jewry, although many of them do not trace their origin to the Spanish expulsion. So they're not, in the film, they're not called Mizrahi or Sephardim. Rather, they're referred to and they refer to themselves as Arab Jews, which connotes more than a hint of backwardness. There were, as I've said, nearly half the Jewish nearly half the Jewish population in Israel in 1960, the eve of the trial. But they were poorly treated in the early decades. We have to face that. That's the fact. They were often looked down upon with contempt by the Ashkenazi leadership and the public. Because of the acute shortage of housing, new immigrants often had to be sheltered for years in about 125 primitive tent camps known as Ma'abarot, where living conditions regarding water, electricity, especially sanitation, were inadequate. Even when wooden huts replaced canvas tents. Well, the large majority of people in those miserable, overcrowded camps were Mizrahim. European Jews had a priority for housing and comprised only 20% of the Ma'abarot. The infant mortality rate was high there, even by Middle Eastern standards. Unemployment, illness, and crime plagued these mainly Mizrahi absorption centers, which were intended to be temporary, but lasted through the 1950s. We see that 13-year-old David, a thief, is on his way toward juvenile delinquency. One of the many fears, along with infectious diseases, that the Ashkenazi elite had about the quote-unquote Arab Jews. They appeared so alien that early on, the film shows, David's boss feels he has to ask David if he's an Israeli. Now, the discrimination the Mizrahi felt is evident near the end of the film as well, when young David is fired by his boss, Zebko. He can't understand why, and then blurts out, "Is it because I'm an Arab Jew?" In 1961, the Jews from Eastern lands kept their discontent bottled up inside. But their resentment would boil over in the following decade when an activist group was formed with a provocative name, the Israeli Black Panthers. Thankfully, this rift, while still present in some quarters, has eased greatly over the generations, as most Mizrahim, while keeping many of their ancestral traditions, feel fully valued as Israeli citizens. Today, they comprise almost half the Knesset and over half the cabinet members. The Eichmann case was a big step in bringing the Mizrahim into the fold. Now, obviously, it had no effect on their physical hardships, but the searing testimonies elicited deep feelings of empathy with the Ashkenazi. Whereas they had thought of the Shoah as confined to European Jewish history, they now saw it as a cataclysm with implications for every Jew in the world, a shared Jewish tragedy. Mizrahi journalists recorded responses such as, "I feel no less pain than an Ashkenazi Jew. Our heart is on fire," or "Our heart is broken." Hundreds of Iraqi Jews gathered in their synagogue to hear Hausner's opening statement, and their rabbis reported emotional reactions filled with tears. One said the prosecutor's voice was like the sound of the shofar. I think this newly felt unity is a main theme of the film. At first, To the chagrin of his school teacher, David seems to be indifferent to the trial. But then, working for Zepco, he becomes obsessed with building the oven to cremate Eichmann's body. He comes to fully understand the gravity of this moment in Jewish history. A Libyan Jew, he nevertheless wants to be recognized as part of this history. Even we see this even in the final scene, right? After half a century, he's still obsessed with the Eichmann case. The other Mizrahi character is a Moroccan Jew, drawn from Eichmann's real-life bodyguard, Amram Lasaki, a sergeant in the border police. I think in the film he's an officer, but in real life he was a sergeant. Those guarding and even in contact with Eichmann, even his barber, had to be Mizrahim, because the thinking went they would be less likely to try to harm the prisoner. But what do we see in the film? The Moroccan bodyguard, a fanatic regarding Eichmann's safety, nevertheless has fantasies about slitting his throat. When the doomed prisoner hands him a final note addressed to his wife, the bodyguard burns it. But while the Mizrahim grew closer to the Ashkenazim in the course of the trial, the prosecution missed an opportunity to deepen that affinity. At one point, David's father from Libya says that he was in a concentration camp. He's referring to the persecution of North African Jewry during the Holocaust. In Libya, occupied by fascist Italy, 3,000 Jews were sent to labor camps, and hundreds died from terrible conditions. In Tunisia, occupied by Vichy France and later the Nazis, 5,000 Jews were forced laborers and 160 deported to death camps in Europe. Before the trial began, the official Jewish community of Tunisia sent a letter to Chief Prosecutor Hausner describing their wartime suffering and asking him to make that part of his case. He refused, however, and none of the 110 witnesses was a North African Jew. But even that omission did not mar the profound Mizrahi engagement in the proceedings. There was another very large group of Israelis whose image and self-image were transformed by the trial, even more than the Mizrahi, namely the Holocaust survivors themselves, whom I noted accounted for over a quarter of Israel's Jewish population in 1961. They too were generally denigrated by the Israeli old-timers. And that's another fact we have to face. Now, there was no disdain for the tiny proportion of survivors who fought back with a gun. They were hailed as heroes. I'm speaking of the partisans, who fought back from the forests, and especially the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. But the overwhelming majority of the survivors, the surviving remnant of European Jewry, those who had endured the ghettos, the killing fields, the extermination camps, they were usually considered inferior to those who had come to Palestine before the war and built up a Jewish state. The survivors were often thought to embody some of the worst characteristics of the degenerate galut: naivete in the face of danger, weakness, even cowardice, And you know the hurtful expression, I'm sure you've all heard this. They went like sheep to the slaughter. A refrain of many of the old timers was, we Sabras would never have allowed something like that to happen to us. Now, some of this scorn had been generated by the shlichim, the emissaries, recruiters, sent by various Zionist factions into the DP camps immediately after liberation. Yes, they encountered people broken in mind, body, and spirit, but they had not anticipated the determination and ability of the survivors to remake their lives as soon as they got the chance. Many Israelis were also mistaken in thinking that the Shoah, with its fierce day-to-day struggle for existence, had permanently weakened the moral fiber of the survivors, and that they wouldn't know right from wrong in a civilized society. Others were concerned that many who had made it out of the fire alive would be permanently scarred by what would later be called post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder, along with a raft of physical illness and physical injuries and diseases that could make them a burden on a new country. Sometimes this judgment could be mean-spirited. After the war, it was thought, without any evidence, that the Nazis made soap out of the fat of Jewish corpses, and survivors in Israel were sometimes derisively referred to as sabon, soap. They were also called human debris. Now, kinder objections to dwelling on the Shoah are voiced in the film by the young Israeli woman who works for the Jewish Agency. She in no way demeans the survivor, Micha, whom she meets at a conference in Poland, but believes that his anguish should remain private so he doesn't have to relive the pain, and also that his victimization does not interfere with building a bold new country, as she puts it. Now, as for the survivors themselves, many were not prepared to speak about it, even if they were capable of dredging up such traumatic experiences. They were focused less on the pain of the past and more on the challenges of the present. They married and raised children. They learned a new language. They found work and housing. And some actually felt guilty, not only that they had survived, but also in this atmosphere of glorifying armed resistance, they felt ashamed that they hadn't fought back. For all these reasons, Israeli society in its early years was not willing or able to confront the magnitude or the meaning of the Shoah. A full-length high school textbook on Jewish history, published in 1948, devoted only one page to the Holocaust. Now, Tom Segev, in his aptly titled book, The Seventh Million, about Israel and the Holocaust, for the 7th million being those million immigrants that I mentioned before, he speaks of near total silence about the Shoah in the 1950s. But I wouldn't go that far. I think that's a judgment that's exaggerated. There was commemoration. As early as 1951, the Knesset instituted Yom HaShoah, nationwide Day of Remembrance. Although it's significant that they officially named it Yom HaZikaron HaShoah V'la Gvura. That means Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, and set the 27th of Nisan as the annual date, the day in 1943 that the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt began. Again, showing the emphasis on Jewish defiance. Yad Vashem was established as early as 1953, although it made nowhere near the impact it would have in later decades. There was a sensational Holocaust trial in 1951, a decade before Eichmann's. Yet that was not the trial of a Nazi perpetrator. That was actually a libel trial of a survivor. He had accused the Hungarian Jewish leader Rudolf Kastner of collaborating with the Nazis by concealing their plans for mass murder in exchange for saving his family and friends. Kastner, an Israeli government official, denied this, and he sued his accuser, survivor, for libel, but lost the case, which meant that the judges believed that Kastner really was complicit. And then he was assassinated by 3 former members of the pre-independence terrorist group, the Stern Gang. I mean, think about this. The public's fascination with a corrupt, colluding Jewish functionary and his murder hardly raised the Israelis' estimation of survivors in general. So the Shoah surfaced in various ways in early Israel, but before the Eichmann case, its momentous place in Jewish history was not grasped. And even more important, it had not been personalized, not taken to heart as millions of individual stories, each filled with its own agony. As the saying goes, the death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. Now, the survivor, Micha, in the film, points to yet another impediment to Holocaust awareness. Israelis who simply could not believe his extraordinary account was true, that it was a figment of his imagination. After encountering this disbelief soon after his arrival, he was so humiliated that he vowed never to tell his story again, until the Eichmann case changed his mind completely. His wrenching narrative about being whipped 80 times and then later facing the incredulity of his own people is drawn from real life. Let's have the next image, please, Gabor. There you have the actor playing him on the left, and then on the right is the real Michael Goldman Gilad. By the way, he is still alive at age 100, Michael Goldman. And Micha plays the role of this Auschwitz survivor. Actually, in this image, you see the number on his forearm. He was a detective for the Israeli police, assisting Hausner in the prosecution. In the course of one of the pre-trial interviews that he conducted, he learned that when he was savagely beaten by an SS officer 18 years earlier and passed out, that he had been struck 80 times. He was told this because the interviewee was a survivor who had been confined to the same ghetto, a medical doctor who had witnessed the relentless beating and who had counted the blows. But the movie does not include what I believe is the most dramatic part of the story. The witness to this atrocity, Dr. Berzminski, was chosen to testify in this case, in the Eichmann case, and in open court, he graphically described the whipping and then looked at the prosecutor's table and declared that the victim was sitting right there, Detective Mickey Goldman Gilad. Not all of the 400 hours of the trial were videotaped, but we do have this testimony, and I want to show it to you. Gabor, if we could have the film clip now.
מה שנעשה עקב אותה החלטה ובאותו פיקוח להשמדת היהודים רלוונטי. את הקשר בין אדולף אייכמן
אני עוד חזרתי קודם לגטו, ובגטו ראיתי איך ההוא השוונברגר נתן בפייג' 80 מכות לילד אחד.
אתה רואה פה בבית המשפט את אותו הנער שקיבל 80 מכות? זה הקצין קולמן על ידי.
זהו הקצין שיושב על יד מר האוזנר.
Więc normalnie po 50...
האוזנר, שהייתי עוזרו האישי במשפט, והיה אנטיק צוקרמן באותו היום גם כן העיד כעד, אנטיק צוקרמן ממפקדי מרד גטו ורשה. נעמדנו ככה ביחד איתי, היה גם כן חיים גורי, אז נוכח. האוזנר פונה אליי בהפסקה ואומר בנוכחותם, אנחנו יושבים כל ערב ביחד, הייתי עוזרו האישי במשפט, אנחנו קוראים את העדויות שאתה גבית מהאחרים במסגרת לשכת 06, ועל עצמך לא סיפרת שום דבר. אז אמרתי, פעם אחת סיפרתי למישהו מפעילי העלייה ב', אז הוא ישב יחד עם אשתו, והוא שכח שאני דובר עברית, אז הוא אמר לאשתו, אלה האנשים עברו כל כך הרבה, שהם כנראה את האמת ואת הדמיון מערבבים ביחד. כשאני שמעתי את הדבר הזה, אף איש לא שמע ממני, אפילו לא אשתי, על המקרה הזה. אז אמר אז אנטיק צוקרמן אומר, וזו הייתה המכה ה-81 שקיבלת. אמרתי, לא רק אני קיבלתי, כולנו קיבלנו את המכה ה-81. זה נכנס להיסטוריה.
Thank you, Gabor. Now, Goldman Gilad's story begins the 1974 Oscar-nominated documentary film entitled The 81st Blow, made by one of Israel's greatest authors, the poet, journalist, and novelist Chaim Guri. The last blow, as you just heard, being that the survivor was not believed. Let's look at the next image. There you see Chaim Guri, and he, a Sabra, an embodiment of that first generation spirit. And I think, you know, he sat in court every day for this long trial. His insightful and deeply felt articles have been published in a book, Facing the Glass Booth. Now, I think these two excerpts from articles at different times really give you an idea of his transformation in the course of the trial. This is the point I'm trying to make. So early in the trial, June 1st, 1961, he says, like an old-timer would, I do not want to hear this short, broken man, survivor, go on about his sufferings, his illnesses, his humiliation. I prefer to be at an army parade in a stadium seeing handsome young people. But then he's in the courtroom for a couple of months. And look at this later dispatch. We must beg forgiveness of those whom we judged in our hearts. We who were not part of them, we judge them without judging ourselves. The Holocaust has happened now, not at any other time between those years and the beginning of the trial. I don't think there's anything else that could show the impact of the trial more than comparing these two texts. Okay, can remove that, Gabor. Now, Guri insisted that the trial changed his life, and afterwards, his prolific literary output was filled with Holocaust themes. Memoirs of survivors began to appear in large numbers as well. The national school system incorporated the Shoah into the curriculum. Scholars closely examined the invaluable testimonies and documents that have been submitted by the prosecution. And these often encouraged further research, a big boost to the vast field of Holocaust and genocide studies. In 1961, the Knesset added to the solemnity of Yom HaShoah by mandating that cafes, restaurants, and clubs had to be closed that day. But most important, the Shoah was now seen as a justification for creating and sustaining the Jewish state. Earlier, its rationale was archaeology, showing Jews to be the indigenous people in this land. Every artifact of ancient Israel that was discovered was considered by Ben-Gurion to be a deed to the Holy Land. Of course, another reason for Zionism was never-ending worldwide anti-Semitism. But after the Eichmann case, Israel could be seen as something much more specific and compelling. The answer to the Holocaust. The national unity fostered by finally facing the Shoah became crystal clear only 6 years later, on the eve of the Six-Day War, when the prospect of total destruction again loomed large, with Egyptian President Nasser seen as the new Hitler. There was dread that Egypt, which had already gone to war against the Jewish state twice, and where several top Nazis had taken refuge, fully meant to carry out its pledge to throw Israel into the sea. Now, as we all know, the IDF won swiftly and decisively against Egypt and 3 other Arab countries. The Eichmann trial having heightened in the Israeli mind the existential nature of this war. The looming danger of annihilation has remained salient ever since, and has never been greater than it is today, after October 7th. As we all know, Israeli proxies wishing the obliteration of the Zionist entity, as they call it, are fighting on multiple fronts, and Iran itself has fired missiles into Israel, as moving toward nuclear weaponry. 63 years ago, the Eichmann case made the liquidation of European Jewry real for all Israelis. That catastrophe still haunts the Jewish state. It is in the background of every national security decision. And I don't think American Jews fully grasp what it means for Israelis to live under such a threat. Thank you.
Fred, it's one of your most brilliant talks. Thank you very much. Everyone, if you'd like to take a minute or two, but please go to the chat function and ask your questions. Fred has another 10, 15 minutes if you have enough questions for him to answer them.